Greetings and welcome to another edition of KSOL Black Talk Radio, the new black media. Today is Sunday, March 17, 2019. Family, this video is about par excellence of the blacks and the death of Egyptology. Our focus is on the late Cheikh Anta Diop, one of the world's greatest African historians. Cheikh Anta Diop was born in Diop, Senegal, in the western part of the African continent on December 23, 1923. Diop attended a Quranic school where the acquisition of knowledge was emphasized. One of several factors distinguishing Diop's work from his worthy precursors is his solid grounding in the physical, natural, and social sciences. Diop was trained in anthropology, archaeology, sociology, linguistics, prehistory, and Egyptology during his tenure at the Sorbonne University in Paris. Upon his arrival in Paris in the fall of 1946, Diop enrolled as a student at one of the elite schools of math. What is not known and most commonly ignored is his background in physics. It is necessary to illuminate Diop's early interest and later advanced knowledge of nuclear physics. He worked in the famed research laboratory of Frederick Joliot Curie, the leading nuclear physicist in France at the time Diop studied there. He later went to the School of Industrial Chemistry and Physics, where a large portion of the curriculum was devoted to laboratory work. Over a 3-year period from 1963 to 1966, Diop worked assiduously to build a much-needed laboratory. When he established the radiocarbon laboratory at IFAN in 1966, it was for the purpose of low energy radioactivity research and C14 dating. It was those years of work in the Gift Sir Yvette Laboratory of Radiocarbon in France, those years of probing deep philosophical issues relating to modern man, experimentations and planning, work, study, organizing, planning, and publishing. All of that energy and activity led to the development of the first radiocarbon laboratory in the black world, and in 1986, one of 3 such labs directed by an African. We must be mindful of the fact that it is no mere coincidence that the last 20 years of Diop's professional career had been spent as director of the radiocarbon laboratory at the University of Dakar in Senegal. Those radiocarbon 14 dating methods continue to provide scientific data. The melanin tests provide further ammunition in the battle to assure ancient Egypt and Nile Valley civilizations were indeed a melanated population. The mere fact we can begin this discussion of Diop's work with a lucid, penetrating assessment of his methodological procedure by a fellow African Egyptologist, a Senegalese colleague with a PhD in Egyptology from the Sorbonne University, is a clear indication of the extent to which Diop has influenced the field of Egyptology, as well as pioneered in establishing a firm foundation for the growth and development of an entire cadre of scientifically trained African Egyptologists. One has to recall that this was a period when others were considered the foremost authorities on African history, even among black scholars and publicists in the United States. Basil Davidson was widely read, discussed, and taught to the exclusion of Africanists. As a matter of fact, even with the discovery of Diop, Afro-American Africanists wantingly ignored the current body of scholarship produced by Africans in the growing discipline of African studies. Suppose continental Africans decided to rely entirely upon European American writers to learn about the black experience. What an experience that would be. So you see where we fall short on looking to our own for guidance. But I digress. Cheikh Anta Diop, one of the most able of present-day scholars writing about Africa, was also one of the greatest African historians. His first major work, Nations Negres et Culture, 1954, is still disturbing the white historians who have made quick reputations as authorities on African history and culture. He issues a devastating attack on modern Egyptology, and that's exactly what this video is about, and we're going to cover that information. The question is asked, if blacks developed the first civilization as Diop argued, why was it not known? Well, he says, quote, the desire to legitimize colonization and the slave trade, in other words, the engineered social condition of the Negro in the modern world, engendered an entire literature to describe the so-called inferior traits of the blacks. In other words, propaganda would be the appropriate description to describe what has been told about black people. Diop claimed that some were so anxious to meet the needs of imperialist exploitation that an entire process of falsification was developed to serve as an infrastructure for the thesis of white superiority and the outlandish thesis of black inferiority. The mind of several generations of Europeans would thus be gradually indoctrinated. Western opinions would crystallize and instinctively accept as revealed truth the equation, Negro equals inferior humanity. To crown this cynicism, colonization would be depicted as a duty of humanity. He links these efforts to a Euro-American process of cultural and intellectual genocide of black people. And boy, was Cheikh Anta Diop right. In fact, Diop makes a monstrous charge of falsification of the history of humanity. His investigations convinced him that the West has not been objective enough to teach African history correctly without crude falsifications. He equates imperialism with the prehistoric hunter who first kills spiritually and culturally before trying to kill physically. He then follows this with his strongest charge that the negation of the history and intellectual realizations of African people is a cultural and mental death with preceded and prepared genocide here and elsewhere in the world. In other words, the Europeans' process of trying to eliminate, skew, and all-around lie about black people in the world is their way of preparing to try to get rid of black people. That's what I gather from what he stated. But I digress. If Egypt is a dilemma in Western historiography, it is a created dilemma. The Western historians, in most cases, have rested on the foundation of what is called Western civilization and the false assumption and claims that the ancient Egyptians were white people. Well, Diop attacks the idea of a white Egypt and links its recent development to grotesque falsifications by modern Egyptology, which was born at an opportune time around the 1820s. About 1820, on the eve of the birth of Egyptology, Count C.F. Volney, the French scholar, reminded the world that the recent slavery of Africans had created an amnesia concerning the glorious past of these very people. That was a European who made that statement. Not long thereafter, Egyptology emerged as an instrument for scholars who used it to achieve a grotesque crime against science with the conscious falsification of the history of humanity. All of a sudden, Egypt became white, a European creation, and Africans were pushed systematically beyond the pale of history. The new Egyptology reinforced the theoretical basis of the imperialism ideology. In fact, capitalism had clear sailing to practice the most ferocious exploitation under the cloak of moral pretext. You see, unfortunately, this false science was supported by the governments of Europe and the US, merged with a new ideology of imperialism and racism that dominated the 19th century academia. Since then, a succession of dishonest Egyptologists, armed with a very determined scholarship, have perpetrated crimes against science, which are known by subscribing to a deliberate falsification of human history. It was propagated with the aid of extensive publicity and taught globally. It had both the material and financial means for its own propagation. So, another important work by the great historian Diop is titled The Cultural Unity of Black Africa, because it creates an independent African-centered conception of Africa, which restores its people to their rightful role as participants and creators in the historical process and not as mere spectators. The oneness of Egyptian and black culture could not be stated more clearly. Because of this essential identity of genius, culture, and race, today all Negroes, all black people, can legitimately trace their culture to ancient Egypt and build a modern culture on that foundation. A dynamic modern contact with Egyptian antiquity would enable blacks to discover increasingly each day the intimate relationship between all blacks of the continent and Mother Nile Valley. By this dynamic contact, the Negro or black race will be convinced that these temples, the forest of columns, these pyramids, these colossi, these bas-reliefs, mathematics, medicine, and all the sciences are indeed the work of his ancestors, and that he had a right and a duty to claim this heritage. Family, one of Diop's major objectives was raising of the idea of a black Egypt to the level of a operative scientific concept, or something that he described as OSC. Again, operative scientific concept. This, or basically, therefore, the considerable new feat is less having stated that the Egyptians were black people. We've been doing that. We've been making that claim in accordance with the ancient writers, of course, than having contributed to making this idea a fact of African and world historical consciousness, and especially a working scientific concept. This is what our predecessors had not succeeded in doing. So, and basically, what he's saying is, we've been saying this all along, that the ancient Egyptians are black, but we have not taken it a step further and making it a scientific, an operative scientific concept, something that black people can work on and develop for the black race. We've been doing a lot of talking about it, but there's not anything significant. We have what's called Egyptology, and that's what the Europeans have developed. Well, we need to nip that in the bud. Egyptology is a joke. I'm gonna sway from this for a second because I gotta talk about this. Egyptology is a joke in the fact that these Europeans who are trying to run this charade, anytime black people have anything to say about ancient Egypt, being black, about the religion, about the culture, the people who run Egyptology, they try to ignore black people. They try to ignore us as if our claims are not legitimate. So what we need to do is develop our own operative scientific concept and say, to hell with you Egyptologists. To hell with Hari Hawass, that fake ass Egyptian who runs the antiquities of ancient Egypt right now. He's that man who has nothing to do with anything African, regarding the ancient Egyptians. No, he's that guy who you see on TV that they push and he acts like he knows what he's talking about. He leads the tours of Egypt and whatnot. He tries to run things there. But guess what? Cheikh Anta Diop even mentioned that he's a fraud. He tries to carry his weight. He's nothing but a fraud. As a matter of fact, to bring it closer to home, I saw Hari Hawass when he came to my hometown because I went to an Egyptian symposium and I asked him some questions and that man was he was fluttering. He couldn't even answer the question properly. But of course he got some guidance and he got some help from the audience. That's how that worked out. I remember him distinctly, but nonetheless, Cheikh Anta Diop, he speaks very poorly of Hari Hawass, or however you pronounce his name. But you know who he is. He's that little fat, little chunky guy that they always put on TV when they're talking about ancient Egypt. He's a fraud, if you ask me. In my opinion, yes, I'm saying it in my video, he's a fraud. I wish he would come to my video and have anything to say so I can challenge his chunky ass. But anyways, I digress, and I didn't mean to get off on that, so like that. But basically, the crux of the great debate on Egyptian civilization, every responsible historian must first question the documents and vestiges the ancient Egyptians left behind and the first-hand accounts of travelers and the ancient Greek and Roman scientists who knew the ancient Egyptians. Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop points out that for the classical European writers, Herodotus, Aristotle, Diodorus, Strabo, and others who were contemporaries of the ancient Egyptians, the Africanness of the Egyptians was visible and evident and did not call for any special reference. He adds, quote, Egypt will play the same role in the rethinking and renewing of African culture that ancient Greece and Rome plays in the culture of the West. The Greek writers, or rather the Greek writer Herodotus, repeatedly referred to the Egyptians as being dark-skinned people with woolly hair. The opinion of the ancient writers on the Egyptians is more or less summed up by Gaston Maspero, who, when he says, quote, by the almost unanimous testimony of ancient historians, the Egyptians belong to an African race, which first settled in Ethiopia on the Middle Nile, and, following the course of the river, they gradually reached the sea. That part right there is very telling because it's telling you which way the Nile flows. The Nile flows from inner Africa and it empties in the Mediterranean Sea. Anyways, the reader needs to be reminded of the fact that at the time of Herodotus' visit to Egypt and other parts of Africa between 480 and 425 BC, Egypt's golden age was over. So in other words, Europeans, you guys came to Egypt hella late. You guys got there hella late. We've been through our golden age already. You guys are barely finding out about our culture and history, in other words. Family, Cheikh Anta Diop predicts that when this historical legacy is understood, when we realize how false is the notion of importing foreign ideologies into Africa, he feels that this stems from a profound ignorance of the African past. He concludes by stating that universal knowledge runs from the Nile Valley toward the rest of the world, in particular toward Greece, which served as an intermediary. As a result, no thought, no ideology is foreign to Africa, which was the land of their birth. The majority of the concepts which we designate foreign are often just distorted, turned around, modified, improved on ideas from the creations of our ancestors. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, dialectic, the theory of being, exact sciences, arithmetic, geometry, the science of mechanics, astronomy, medicine, literature, architecture, arts, etc. All of it originated in Africa. Anyways, this is KSOL Black Talk Radio, the new black media. Hoping you like this video. I hope you share it. And most importantly, this video is an attack. I'm saying it clearly. It's an attack on Egyptology and your fraudulent system of running our African history and our culture into the graves. That you have ran our history into the gutter by changing it around, changing faces, and making it appear like it's white when we know it is not. Egyptology, you're done. We're going to develop something new. We need something to replace it. And I have to agree with Cheikh Anta Diop. An operative scientific concept would be just that the black race needs. We need to shut this Egyptology field. We need to shut it down. They don't belong. They are currently running our culture and our history, and they've been running it into the wrong directions. We need to shut that crap down. This is an attack on you, Egyptology. Again, this is KSOL Black Talk Radio. Share and like this video. Peace out.